welcome to this webinar, How to Write a Compelling CV by jobs.ac.uk, an international jobs board for careers in higher education, as well as a dedicated careers advice source with resources, articles and webinars to support you on your career journey. This is the first in our new webinar series called Career Advice Hour, where jobs.ac.uk invite a careers expert to focus on one topic to help you in your job seeking today. And today we're going to look at how to write a compelling CV. I'm just going to share my screen here and then quickly introduce myself. Okay, so my name is Cathy Balfe and I'm a career coach based in Limerick in Ireland. I worked and lived in the UK for 8 years until 2018 when I relocated to Ireland. I have several career changes behind me myself, including a stint in academia, having pursued a PhD in economics in UCL. I finished that PhD in 2015 and shortly afterwards retrained as a careers advisor. I worked as a careers advisor for several years with the University of London, supporting their students' career development, and I was primarily based in Queen Mary University of London during my time there. I set up my own career coaching business called Career Coach Me in 2019, and I've since worked with nearly 500 individuals, helping support their career development. And in terms of career development, there's three main pillars I help people with. One is the area of career guidance and career choice, so helping people figure out what they want to do. Secondly, I help people write strong CVs, cover letters and applications. And finally, I help people prepare to do well at interview. In terms of the CV advice, there's two main services I provide. One is a CV rewriting service and the second is a CV review service. I've worked with professionals across a really wide range of sectors, including academia, healthcare, the public sector more generally, manufacturing, construction, IT, real estate, retail, legal professionals, finance, as well as the arts sector. I've seen thousands of CVs at this stage, both from my time supporting students at the University of London, but also through my own private practice. So hopefully I'm well placed at this stage to share some tips about what I think makes a strong CV. Pre-submitted questions have been submitted ahead of the webinar, so thank you to anybody who sent those questions in. Hopefully I'll be covering some of those questions as I go through this presentation in any case, but there'll also be a time for questions and answers later on in the webinar. So if you do have any questions as we go through this webinar, please do enter them into the Q&A box in the top right-hand corner of your Teams screen, and I'll come to that later on in the webinar. In terms of the agenda today, so the screen or the slide here shows what we're hoping to cover today. So firstly, we're going to look at timing. So when is the best time to write your CV? Secondly, we're going to look at tailoring and the importance of tailoring your CV for different roles. We'll look at what an employer is looking for. So what are the employer needs for a specific role? We're going to talk a little bit about ATS Insights. So what is an applicant tracking system and what does it mean for you and your CV? We'll be talking a little bit about layout, design and formatting. I'll cover some common pitfalls I've seen in the CVs that have come across my desk, and I'll share some final tips for success before coming to that Q&A section and wrapping up. And before I get started, I just want to mention that there'll be a couple of interactive activities during this webinar. So it'll be really great if you have the current version of your CV to hand, and also ideally a job description for the type of role you'd like to apply for in the future. Don't panic if you don't have these to hand. You'll still get some benefit out of the webinar today, and you'll be able to participate in those activities in any case. Okay. So firstly, looking at when is the best time to write your CV. So I work with clients all the time, and they'll often come to me and say, Cathy, will you write my CV for me? And I'll say, sure. What are we writing the CV for? And sometimes clients don't have a job role in mind. And that's a really difficult thing to do. It's really hard to write a CV when you don't have a job description in front of you. And so this is a model of career development I often share with my clients. Okay, and this is a step-by-step path you can follow through a period of career transition, let's say. So the first step here is career choice and figuring out what you want to do. The second step is getting ready, right? So once you know what you want to do, it's about getting any skills, experience, or education you need to pursue that option. And the third step is about making it happen, right? So that's when you're actively doing the job search, you're making your applications, and you're preparing for interviews. And it's that application stage when it's the best time to write your CV, right? You've found the job that you're interested in, you've done all the things that you need to do in terms of getting yourself ready for it. You found a job you're interested in, and that's the great time, I think, to start writing your CV. Great. Okay, in terms of tailoring your CV, so why is tailoring your CV important and what does tailoring your CV mean? So, tailoring your CV essentially means writing a different version of your CV for different roles that you're applying for. And it might not mean going back and completely starting your CV from scratch, right? It might be small tweaks that you're making to your CV over time, depending on what a recruiter is looking for. But I'm going to ask you the first interactive exercise here. So, how long do you think it takes a recruiter to read a CV? So if you have a piece of paper and a pen in front of you, I'll give you a couple of seconds to make a little guess there about how long you think it takes a recruiter to read your CV. So hopefully everybody's made a guess there at this stage, but you might be surprised to hear that recruiters will rule your CV out within the first 10 seconds if they don't see that you're meeting their minimum requirements. Okay, and this hopefully underscores that the importance of tailoring your CV for a role, right? You want to make sure that you're making it clear to the recruiter in those first couple of seconds that you're a good fit for that position. Okay, so let's go into this in a bit more detail. Okay, so what's the benefit of tailoring your CV? So first of all, you're making it easier for the recruiter to see your relevant skills, experience, and qualifications, and you're getting them to want to keep reading. Secondly, I think it's really good in terms of showing your motivation. I think it can be quite clear to a recruiter if you've gone to the effort of tailoring your CV for a role, and I think that helps shows your motivation. So I think that's the second, good reason to tailor your CV. Some additional tips here before I move on. One, I suggest that you don't use the quick apply buttons that you often see on like LinkedIn or Indeed or other jobs boards. So what happens if you click quick apply is that your generic profile is forwarded onto the employers. You don't have any opportunity to tailor your application materials if you're using those quick apply buttons. So wherever possible, I recommend clients try and go to the employers' websites. Most employers, particularly large employers, will have their own job vacancy part of their website, and they'll often have their own application portal that you can access there. So I would recommend people apply through that portal wherever possible. And the benefit of that is that it allows you to tailor your application materials, right? You can tweak your CV for that role, you can upload a tailored cover letter, and you're applying on their preferred portal. A second key tip here before I move on as well is that if you are tailoring your application materials, I recommend you keep a copy of every application that you send so you can refer back to it later. So, for example, let's say you're applying for multiple jobs, you might want to have a job application folder stored on your laptop. Within that folder, you might want to have subfolders of the different employers' names and the copy of the CV and other application materials you use to apply for that role. And then if you get called to interview, you can always quickly go back and see what you've sent and what they have on the desk in front of them when they're interviewing you. Okay, so how do you tailor your CV? Okay, so there's basically two steps here, not rocket science. So the first step is figuring out what the skills, experience, and qualifications the employer is looking for. And the second step is showing them the evidence that you tick all, ideally, or most of their boxes. Okay. So how do we find out what employers are looking for? So what's involved in this first step? So the good news is that they usually make it pretty clear, right? It's usually fairly clear in the job description about what they're looking for in terms of jobs, in terms of skills, experience, and education. Um, as well as looking, so often when you see a job vacancy advert, there'll often be like a role description, jobs, duties, and then the requirements. Okay, so the requirements is probably the first place to go, right? They'll usually have a fairly detailed list of what they look for there. But I'd also recommend reading the other parts of that job advert, right? The role description and the duties, because you can often get additional insight into what skills they might be looking for in their ideal candidate through that analysis as well. And for other employers, and particularly large employers, it can also be worth visiting their websites. Large employers will also often have these employer values that they try to abide by as an organization. But when they're recruiting candidates, they're often looking for candidates who abide or live up to those values as well. So again, that can just give you a bit more insight into what that employer is looking for. Okay, so what we're going to do here, if it's okay, I'm going to ask you to do the second activity today. And I'm going to get you to go through a job vacancy and do that analysis and try and pull out those skills, experience, and education that an employer is looking for. So if you guys have come with a job description, it would be great if you use that to do this analysis. If you don't, I have this job description on the jobs.ac.uk website that we can all use. And I think hopefully Jackie has put that into the chat box. I can't actually see the chat box from here without minimizing my screen, but hopefully you guys all have access to that job vacancy link, so you can open that up on your screens there. And we'll take just about 2 minutes to have a quick look through that, if that's okay. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share the analysis I've done using the job description I shared, that timetabling and examination project officer role, just to show you the list of skills that I came up with. And again, that's a kind of formula or approach you can apply to future jobs you're going to be analysing and applying for. But this is, I've copied this basically from the job description. This is the role description that they have. Okay, there's quite a lot in here. You can see that I've highlighted in yellow all the bits I pulled out that I found are relevant skills or experiences that the role might be looking for in their ideal candidate. Okay, so things around producing online timetables, there's bits around centrally managed exams, there's a bit about web room booking service. So, for example, if you had any experience administering a web room booking service or even using it, that could be relevant and worth including somewhere in your application materials. Same for some of these other things that they're talking about here about, process improvements, stakeholder engagement plans, working with senior stakeholders as well. So you can see here, you can often pull quite a lot out of a role description, as well as other parts of that job description. So if you move on to the main duties here, so this is the second part of that job description. And again, you can see I'm pulling out quite a lot here in terms of what this employer is looking for in their ideal candidate. Again, things like communication plans, promoting projects and outcomes. So, for example, any social media experience or dissemination experience would be relevant there. There's looking for people who can collaborate with colleagues cross-functionally. There's a bit here about training sessions, process improvement, and so on. And then finally, we come to the person specification. And interestingly, there's almost less that I pulled out of the person specification than I have out of the role description and the job duties. But you can see here they're talking about being educated to degree level or significant relevant experience, and policy, procedures and processes, sustainability, equality and diversity, and some IT experience down here as well. But if you see, if I kind of gather these all together, you can see I've about 8 or 9 things here. I've pulled out a role description, maybe in there 8 and 9 of the main duties, and 5 or 6 out of the person specification. So that's kind of the point trying to make, not just focusing on what you have in this part of the job description, but also reading through the other verbs that they have, because you can often pull information there about what they might be looking for, an ideal candidate as well. So this essentially is the blueprint of what that person is looking for. And once you have this blueprint in front of you, I think it becomes a lot easier to go away and write a well-tailored CV for a particular role. Okay, so once we know what an employer is looking for, the second step here is providing evidence that you can tick all, ideally, or most of their boxes. Okay, so every skill, experience, and qualification that we've pulled out in that blueprint, and spend time thinking about what evidence you can provide against each of these. And wherever possible, try and add some specific details or quantify your achievements in relation to that skill. And, adding details adds credibility, I think, and also gives additional insight into what you've achieved in your career. So I have an example here. So, sorry, excuse me. So instead of saying, worked with colleagues to deliver a set of career supports to the School of Economics and Finance, you might instead say, develop strong team working skills, working closely with another careers consultant and an employer engagement officer within the same department, as well as collaborating with the wider careers team, academic stakeholders, and the wider student body at student staff meetings. So this second bullet point is a lot longer than this first one. And there's a couple of things I will kind of highlight here. First of all, I highlighted the relevant skill. So I've said develop strong team working skills, right? So that's why I'm putting the bullet point in here. This is the key thing I'm trying to draw their attention to. I've included some specific details, right? So instead of just saying I've worked with colleagues, I'm naming them specifically so that employer can see, or the recruiter can see, the range of people I've worked with. And again, it's those adding those specifics, I think, adds credibility as well as interest. Finally, I have a pointer to using some action verbs. Okay, so I've got developed, worked, collaborated in here. So using some of those strong action verbs as well, I think can really develop those bullet points. Okay, so we're going to move on to the third activity here. And again, we're going to take 2 minutes to do this. What I'd like you to do is to take that list of skills that you developed in the previous exercise when you were going through that job description. So the list of skills that you pulled out of that. I'd like you to choose one that you feel like you can provide evidence for from your past experience. And I'd like you to develop that bullet point. Okay, so to write out a bullet point that you could use in your own CV that's providing evidence for that particular skill. And what I'd like you to do is try and include some specifics, like I talked about in the previous slide, and some action verbs as well. So again, we're going to take about 2 minutes to do that, if that's okay. So hopefully you got an opportunity to give that an attempt. If you didn't finish it, don't panic. You can always come back to it. But what I really wanted to kind of get across was that activity in terms of doing that skills analysis on a job vacancy advert, and then providing evidence against each of those. Okay, so that's kind of what I wanted to get across here. So we're going to move on, and you can always come back to that and finish it at the end of the webinar if you like. Okay, but I just want to make this point as well. So if you're finding it hard to tick some of these boxes, right? So if you're finding it hard to provide evidence for some of these skills that an employer is looking for in the types of roles that you want to apply for, you could always think about what you could be doing in the meantime to build up that skill and provide evidence that you have or are developing it. So for example, let's say that public speaking is one of the skills that they're looking for and you don't have much experience of that. You could, for example, go and join your local Toastmasters club where you'd be standing up in front of a group of people on a weekly basis and developing those public speaking skills. And that's something that you could then be putting onto your CV, right? Within your interest section, potentially you could be talking about your involvement in Toastmasters and how you're developing your public speaking skills through that. That's just an example, right? You could apply that to different skills that you potentially want to build on your own CV. Yeah, and it's just this kind of getting you to think as well about, you can have the most perfect CV in the world, but if there are people who are applying who are a better fit for you, like that can be feeding into that decision as well. So not just worth thinking about how we can present your experience as nicely as possible, but also thinking kind of creatively about what else you could be doing in the meantime to build your CV so that you have a strong CV that you're applying for. And sometimes people sign up for additional courses as well to upskill. And I just wanted to mention there's lots of online platforms out there that you can upskill for relatively low cost and relatively easily online. So for example, I don't know if people have heard of Coursera.org, but it's worth potentially looking up. There's courses on there across a really wide range of different topics, and you could be upskilling from the comfort of your own homes. And once you start any of those courses, again, that's something you can put on your CV, right? Within a training, the training section potentially of your CV, you could be talking about the different Coursera modules that you've enrolled on. You don't have to have finished it. So for example, if I started a Coursera module today in something that was relevant to what I wanted to be applying for, I'd be putting it on my training section as, December 2024 to the present. Okay, so this is just a quick slide as well to encourage you to think creatively about what experience you can demonstrate on your own CVs. I think some of you will be coming from an academic experience and potentially thinking about applying for non-academic roles. And I just wanted to encourage you to think about the kind of transferable skills you could potentially draw on when writing those non-academic CVs. So for example, many of you coming from an academic background might have experience of working as a teaching assistant or a lecturer or presenting at conferences. Obviously, that's a really good opportunity to demonstrate your public speaking and communication skills. Similarly, if you have experience of writing research papers or sending successful grant applications, that's evidence of strong written communication and also attention to detail. If you've worked as part of a research group, opportunities to point to collaboration, team working skills there. Also, there's other skills I'm thinking about here, like time management. Again, lots of people in academia are juggling different balls, like, teaching, research, maybe supervising PhD students, applying for grant funding, and so on. So, great opportunities there to show your ability to multitask. If you've managed research budgets or PhD budget as well in the past, you can point to your financial management or budget management skills. Often universities are very multicultural environments. So again, you can point to your familiarity or your experience in working in a multicultural and diverse environment. Often, again, people coming from an academic background might have quite advanced technical skills, right? So you might have developed a lot of IT skills through your research or laboratory skills. There's also people management skills that you can point to. So for example, again, if you've teaching experience, you have experience of managing a class, you might have managed some theses, you might have managed several PhD or research students. And also if you have experience of disseminating your research findings, for example, you could potentially point to your transferable skills in the area of marketing and social media. And obviously, there's no point in just listing all these skills. You have to obviously think about, that tailoring point that we made earlier and really focusing on the skills that the employer is looking for. Okay, moving to applicant tracking systems. Okay, so first of all, some of you might not have heard of what an applicant tracking system is. So here's a quick definition that I pulled from the Oracle website. So an applicant tracking system is software for recruiters and employers to track candidates through the recruiting and hiring process. This software can come equipped with capabilities ranging from simple database functionality to a full service suite of tools that makes it easy for businesses of any size to filter, manage, and analyze candidates. Okay, so what does that mean in plain English? So it basically means when you apply to an employer using their online application system, or if you're applying through sending or uploading a CV, what's happening is that their applicant tracking system is trying to take all the information out of that and it's extracted into a database. So for example, you might have one row per candidate, right? You might have first name Cathy Balfe, first name Cathy, last name Balfe, whether or not they've completed university education, where they went to university, the name, of course, lots of other variables, you might have things like years of experience, skills, and so on, and are linked to the CV as well. And so this is what it means. It's kind of trying to extract the information out of your CV into a database. And then employers can potentially search through that database for candidates that are a good fit, and depending on the keyword research that they're doing. Okay. So yeah, there's lots more information out there. I wouldn't say that I'm a total expert in applicant tracking systems. So if you want to find more about it, like there's lots of articles out there that you can read up on it. But in terms of what advice I would give to people who are applying to organizations that might be using an ATS, there's a couple of generic bits of advice here. So first of all, use a file format like a Word document or a PDF. And they'd be very standardly accepted file formats. But of course, when you're applying to an employer, make sure that you're applying in a file format that's accepted by them, and they'll often have the different types of files that they'll accept on their application portal. Use a pretty standard font. So Calibri is one that I use a lot, and I typically use a font size between 10.5 and 11.5. I think a good tip here is to print your CV once you've finalized it and look at it in front of you and see whether the font looks like it's about the appropriate size, and make sure that the margins is all as you expect. Also for ATS systems, you're recommended to avoid using tables and columns. So basically what can happen is that the ATS is trying to read by line. And so if there's multiple columns, it might not interpret your CV in the way that you want it to interpret it. So the advice is just to avoid multiple columns and tables. Also avoid all graphics, icons, pictures, lines, boxes. And often people are recommended as well to use a plain text converter, right? So what that means is that you can go online and there's plain text converters out there. You copy and paste all the information from your CV into that plain text converter online, And you can see basically what the database will be looking at, what's the plain text that it is taking and putting into that database. So that can be a nice activity just to kind of sense check how your CV is going to be interpreted. And don't put anything into your footer or header sections of your CV, especially important things like contact details. I remember somebody sent me a CV once and I opened it on my phone because I had it with me. And I couldn't see their contact details. And I was like, wow, that's really strange. They haven't included any contact details at all. But then when I opened the CV later on my laptop, I could see the contact details. And what had happened is she put it into the header and it just had disappeared off when I opened it on my phone. So sometimes strange things can happen with headers and footers. So just don't put anything in there. Use easily understandable section titles like work experience, education, skills. And I'll be showing you a sample CV in a minute that's ATS compliant. Also, you can download it off my website, careercoachme.ie, and also the team at jobs.ac.uk will be including that as part of the email attachment that registered applicants are going to be getting later on today. Okay, let's talk a little bit about keyword research. So it can be helpful to reflect the language that recruiters or employers are using on your CV, do it subtly, as it's more likely that that's what they're going to be using for search terms. So let's say that they talk about interpersonal skills, whereas you have communication skills in your CV. You might want to change the language a little bit to reflect how they talk about those skills. It can also be useful to use short and long versions of relevant terms on your CV where applicable. So for example, search engine optimization and SEO. So you might want to include both of those terms somewhere on your CV. And also, like, I think it's a bit around using common sense here. Put yourself in the shoes of the recruiter and think about what keyword searches they might be using to look for appropriate candidates for that role. And just try and incorporate those keywords throughout your CV. Okay, so this is basically like the template, the CV template. You guys are going to get emails later. And I just wanted to put it up here on the screen so you can see what an ATS compliant CV looks like. And so as you can see, there's no boxes, there's no multiple columns here, there's no fancy formatting, no pictures or icons or anything like that. So this would be an example of an ATS compliant CV, but you can still see that it's easy to read through. You can find the sections quite easily. It's easy to scan through and look for the relevant information. And we'll be talking a bit more about the different sections in a couple of minutes. So for now, I'm just going to move on past this. Okay, moving to layout and design. Okay, so a big question lots of people have is how long should your CV be? I would say for the vast majority of people, a 2-page CV is likely to be appropriate. There are some exceptions to that, okay? So if you have very little experience, a 1-page CV is okay. I would try to avoid having 1.5 pages because if you have 1.5 pages, the recruiter might be thinking, oh gosh, did they not have anything else to tell me? Do they have no other skills that they could talk about? So you either want to have a 1-page CV where you've kind of curated your relevant skills and experience into that 1-page CV, or go and fill the 2 pages. And there's things you can do, right, to kind of help you with that. You can play with the margins and the font size and the white spacing. So, there's ways to kind of be a bit flexible about how you might achieve that. Other exceptions to this 2-page CV rule would be academic CVs. So often people applying for academic roles would have a longer CV where they'd be including additional sections like research publications, research funding, conferences attended, research students supervised, and so on. So they're often including a lot more information, and there might be multiple pages. It wouldn't be uncommon to see a 6, 7, or 8-page CV, say, for an academic CV. Somebody asked via one of the submitted questions, what's the difference between an academic CV and a non-academic CV? So hopefully that answers that. An additional point I'd just say here, if you have an academic background and you're applying for non-academic jobs, I would recommend that you're moving your CV towards that 2-page CV where you're really pulling out the relevant skills for the role that you're applying for. Because if a recruiter is used to like looking through and scan reading a 2-page CV and again 8-page CV, you've given them a lot more work to really try and look through and find those relevant skills. There was also a question submitted about a narrative CV. So to be honest, it's not something I've really come across before. I've never helped anybody to write a narrative CV. So I did a little bit of searching. And my understanding is that narrative CVs is something that's come in quite recently and is used by some of the research institutes, particularly in the UK, but also internationally. And the idea is that people applying for research grants are encouraged to move away from just reporting hard metrics like research impact to a more narrative way of discussing the impact of their research. But talking beyond that is outside the scope of this webinar. So what I would recommend that you do is you go to some online guides around that. So for example, some of the research institutes have a lot more information up there on what a narrative CV is, and they also have kind of some downloadable formats that you can use. So if you are thinking about writing a narrative CV, I'd point you towards that. And doctors would often have longer CVs as well, because similar to academics, there's additional sections that they're often including things like clinical rotations, specialist training, conferences, research funding, publications, and so on. Some professions require ongoing CPD. So for example, solicitors, and what they might like to do is to include additional appendix for a log of their CPD training. So if a recruiter wants to go to that detail, they can go and look at the appendix to the CV, but you're still keeping your CV nice and short and 2 pages for the most part. Okay, in terms of the sections, so what are the standard sections that you might want to include on your CV? Okay, so first of all, you want to have your contact details front and center. It's very common to then have a profile section where you're summarizing, your relevant education and experience and a couple of your skills. Typically, most people would have their work experience section next, followed by education, skills, and an optional interest section. This is just a guideline, okay? So think about what makes sense for you and your CV. Other common sections I would often see included in people's CV would be a training section. So you might have, CPD or less formal training besides your university education. So you might want to include that in a separate section. Also, sometimes people might have a volunteering section, for example, in there, or additional information as well. What I would also say is that sometimes people often ask about what order the two should be in. Should work experience come first or should education come first? I would say put in whatever is most relevant for your stage of your career development. So for example, if you're a recent graduate in an area that's very relevant for the roles that you're applying for, I would probably include your education section above your work experience. Whereas if you've been working for several years and you have lots of relevant work experience, I'd be inclined to put your work experience ahead of your education section. Okay, so let's talk through these sections in a little bit more detail. So up here you can see your contact details. Okay, so you don't have to call it a contact details section. Also, you don't have to include curriculum vitae or CV at the top of your CV. It's very obvious what this document is. So you want to start front and center with your name and your contact details. If you want to include your LinkedIn profile, that's totally fine. Just make sure that your LinkedIn profile is relatively up to date and is reflecting the same information that's in your CV. And then you're going to move into the profile section. Okay, so this profile section is a couple of sentences that summarizes, your relevant experience, education, and a couple of key skills. And we're going to talk about this in a bit more detail in a couple of moments because I think it's quite an important part to get right. And then we have the selected work experience section. So a couple of things to talk about here maybe. So it's in reverse chronological order. Okay, so you have the most recent experience first and working from there. I think limited use of bold font can be very effective. So you can see here I've bolded the name of the organization and I've right aligned the date. So it's really easy for somebody to scan through and see what this person was doing when. And then I have the role title in italics afterwards. So in those 2 lines, you see you're getting quite a lot of information, right? You're getting the name of the organization, the name of the role that you had, and the dates that you were working there. And then you want to have a couple of bullet points. We talked about this earlier, but these bullet points are basically trying to achieve 2 things, okay? One, you're trying to give a general understanding of what that role was all about, but you also want to really be demonstrating the relevant skills for the role that you're applying for. Okay, so you really want to be making sure that these bullet points are really both explaining what your job was all about, but also clearly demonstrating to the recruiter that you have the skills that they're looking for. Okay, so then we're moving to education. And so again, you want to have this reverse chronological order with the most recent qualifications first. If you have, as I said earlier, if you've done some additional training courses that aren't as weighty as your education section, I'd recommend that you include that in a separate training section, because you don't want to like downvalue your university degree, right? So I'd usually have the university degrees in an education section and then a training section if you've done lots of additional certificates since. You could then have a technical skills section. I recommend you just have technical skills in here. So for example, any IT skills that you have, language skills, laboratory skills as well will go in there. As I said, the interest section is an optional section. I think it's nice to include if you're showing additional skills that the recruiter is looking for through your participation in various interests, that you don't show the. I also think it can be a nice thing if there's things there that are likely to break the ice if you go into an interview. So for example, this person has like running, that they recently completed the Dublin Marathon. And if you're interviewed by somebody who's also interested in running, they might pick up on that and be like, oh, I did the Dublin Marathon too. So, it can be an icebreaker. So another nice reason to include it. But at the same time, it's definitely not a requirement in your CV. I personally don't have an interest section in my own CV at the moment. I have two young children who take up all my time. So I don't really have time for too much outside of that. So it's fine not to have an interest section as well. Okay, so let's look at the profile section in a little bit more detail. Okay, so I think this is a really important part of your CV. Remember earlier we talked about how a recruiter will typically look at your CV for less than 10 seconds before deciding whether to keep it or bin it. And the profile is one of the first things that they're going to read. So you really want this to be making an impact. So a couple of things, like I usually follow a bit of a formula when it comes to writing a profile, okay? So my first sentence or first one or two sentences would try to really give an overview of that person's relevant experience in education. I've also pulled out a couple of skills that I want to get across at the get-go as well. So here you can say I'm saying I'm highly motivated and highly technical individual. And then going into my experience, right? 2 years software delivery experience and 10 years Scrum Master experience in the finance and insurance industry. So you can see in those first two sentences, I've done a pretty good job of getting across my relevant experience and a couple of key skills. The next couple of sentences then are then pulling out additional key skills that that recruiter is looking for and trying to provide some evidence for each of those. So remember earlier when we did that blueprint of what an employer is looking for, you're trying to get a sense from that, what are the key skills for that role? And it's really great to try and focus on those skills in this profile section, particularly if you can really back that up. So another one here is they pulled out a second skill, which is strong stakeholder management skill. And you can see in the sense that they provide a little bit of evidence for that, right? They've talked about working in a large multinational organization where obviously stakeholder management skills will be pretty important. They've talked about a third skill, and finally they've gone on to a fourth skill. So what I'd like you to do in our final activity today is to take, again, maybe 2 or 3 minutes for this exercise, if that's okay. And I'd like you to have a go at writing your own profile. So in your first sentence, it'd be great if you could try and summarize your relevant experience, education, and your key strengths in a similar way to what we did up here, okay? Then once you finish that, try and write a couple of sentences, pulling out some key skills and provide a little bit of evidence of pointing to where you've demonstrated that skill through your career. And then if you have time, you can discuss either a fourth skill in the final sentence or provide a brief statement around your motivation or future career goals in a way that's strategically aligned to that role and also authentic. Okay, so we're going to take about 2 minutes to do that final activity. Okay, so hopefully you guys made a bit of an attempt at that. And as I said, I don't expect people to have this fully polished at this stage. And I would encourage you to come back and have another look at this at the end of the call. I do think it's a really important section to get right, because again, it's one of the first things that a recruiter is going to look at. Okay, moving on to some common pitfalls that I've seen in the CVs that come across my desk. Besides some of the things that we talked about, okay, so obviously there's all the things that we talked about up to now, but one is sometimes people use superfluous language. So what do I mean by that? So people sometimes say that they're excellent at this and they're really like amazing at this, and without providing any evidence behind those claims. So I think it works, it's more effective to be kind of factual in your discussion about your skill set and try to provide that concrete evidence and the specifics that we talked about wherever possible. I think it adds credibility. And similarly, try to quantify your achievements. So rather than saying, oh, you're amazing or great at this or that, point to achievements that you've had that really provide that evidence of your ability in that skill area. I sometimes see CVs that read like a job description, and actually sometimes people have literally copied and pasted across the bullet points from their previous job description into their CV. And there's a couple of problems with that, right? One, it's really boring. And two, your CV isn't unique to you, right? There's nothing in there about what you've achieved, nothing specific that adds credibility or interest. So really, I would recommend you don't do that and you sit down and make your CV unique to you and your experience. I have a ChatGPT warning here. We'll talk a little bit more about ChatGPT in a minute, but just a warning first. Again, it can read like a job description if you're just pulling straight off ChatGPT or another generative AI into your CV. ChatGPT can only give you what can only give you what you give it. So it is going to be generic, kind of by definition, right? So try to avoid that. And again, coming back to what we said in terms of providing specifics, quantifying it, making it unique to you. A thing I'll often see in a CV as well is a list of skills with no evidence, and it's not always aligned to the role. Right? So imagine if I had a CV and I have a skills section and I say I'm a strong communicator, I've great interpersonal skills, I'm a great networker, but I'm not backing that up, okay? It's not that credible. And unless that's the specific list of skills that the recruiter is looking for, it's not going to land that well with them, right? The recruiter might be like, does Cathy know what job she's applying for? Right. So they're the two problems I often see with those lists of skills. So what I recommend people do as an alternative, particularly for those softer transferable skills, instead of having them listed in a skills section, really try to build them into your CV, right? So mention them in the profile, talk about them in the bullet points, within your work experience or education section. And what I do recommend people do is they have the skills section, but they're really just kind of including the technical skills there. So like I said before, like the IT skills or the laboratory skills or the language skills, for example. And people will often forget or think that they can't include their current course that they're studying or their current role. They've forgotten to update it. So make sure that you are including those details. Often they're some of the most relevant parts of your CV for the role that you're applying for. Another pitfall I sometimes see is that people don't give the right weight to the most relevant parts of their CV. There's nothing that says you have to put the same amount of bullet points in for a job that you did 10 years ago on a part-time basis as you do to the job that you're currently doing. Okay, so be strategic in that. Think about what the most relevant parts of your CV are and making sure that you're giving enough weight to that. If it's your current course or if it's a course that you studied, if that's the most relevant part of your CV, you can go into more details, right? Tell me about the modules you might have studied as part of that degree. Tell me about some of the projects you completed and the skills that you might have developed through that project work. And tell me about the thesis you potentially did, right? So you can see how you could really expand into different sections depending on how important they are going to be in your application. Avoid giving unnecessary information. So in the UK and Ireland, it would be non-standard. So it wouldn't be standard to include things like your date of birth, your marital status, or a picture. Obviously check the country norms. So if you're applying in other countries, some countries it is very standard to include a picture on your CV, for example. So make sure you're checking and abiding to the country norms in whatever country you're applying to. Use bullet points. So I sometimes see CVs where the job description or your past experience is written in paragraph form. Again, that's really hard to scan read really quickly, right? And it's really hard to pull out the key skills that you've developed through that. So I really recommend that you use bullet points to help that. I also sometimes see CVs where people have given a kind of a lengthy enough description about what their previous companies did, I would avoid doing that. Okay, so if possible, through your bullet points, you want to give a sense of what your role was all about and the context in what that role was done in, so like the industry or kind of general sector that you were working in, if it's not clear from the employer's name. But you don't want to be spending time on your CV or space on your CV explaining what your previous employer did. If the recruiter is really interested, they can go and Google search that themselves. Okay. So some final tips before we turn to the questions and answers. So I warned you about some of the pitfalls about it's such a hard one to say, isn't it? I warned you about some of the pitfalls of chat GPT in the previous slide, but let's talk about some of the benefits as well. So if you feed chat GPT a job description and you ask it to write a CV for that role, what you'll get is a pretty good starting point, right? You probably get a pretty nice template. Some of the key pointers might be in there that you might want to incorporate on your own CV. So it can be a good place to start. Also, if you're finding it difficult to write a particular bullet point or just feels like it's not reading that professionally, or you just think it could be written better, you can also feed it a particular bullet point, right, and ask it to rewrite that bullet point for you for a CV. And it might improve it a little bit. You might be happier with what it comes back with. So you can use ChatGPT to help you as well in terms of your CV writing. Again, just another warning here, make sure that you're aware of what it's going to be using your data for, right? And make sure you're comfortable with whatever you're sharing with any generative AI software you're using. A minor tip here as well, if you are including your LinkedIn URL on your CV, there's a way to shorten your URL. Okay, so my original LinkedIn URL was something like www.linkedin.com/Cathy, and then all these random numbers and letters, and it looked really ugly on my CV. But there is a way to shorten that. It only takes a couple of seconds. You do have to go through LinkedIn to do it, but there is information on the website there about how to do it. Again, it's only a couple of seconds work, and it can tidy up your CV a little bit. In terms of references, so again, this is a question that came in from somebody. It would be common to include references available upon request at the end of your CV. That's what I recommend people do. It's like signing off your CV, right? So when a recruiter gets to that bit, they know that they're at the end of your CV. I would recommend that you don't include references, contact details, email address, or names on your CV. There's a couple of reasons behind that. One is from a GDPR perspective, right? So your references might not like their contact details shared widely. And also from the employer's perspective, you're kind of showing employers that you're aware of those kind of professional norms and GDPR requirements. And the second benefit as well here is that if you have references available upon request and an employer comes to you and asks for your references, you have the opportunity then to give your references a heads up, right? And you might be like, hi, John, I've gotten through to the final round of interviews at Pfizer, and they might contact you shortly looking for a reference from me. Is that still okay with you? The benefit of that is that John, or your reference, is now anticipating that call, right? And he's maybe thought about what he might say about you in a way that's relevant for that job. So it's a kind of a nice to give them the heads up. I am also going to be sharing a CV checklist with you. So again, that's going to come from the team at jobs.ac.uk in that email that you're going to get later on. So you're going to get the CV template and the CV checklist. I think it's a really nice thing to go through when you've written your CV, just to kind of sense check it and make sure that there's no big errors or omissions on your CV. And also there's two links that I think might be quite helpful on that CV checklist. One is about how to treat visa status on your CV. So for some people on the webinar today, that might be relevant. So there's some nice bits of advice and tips on that article. There's also another link to an article on how to handle gaps on your CV. Again, it's something that came in from some questions and the pre-submitted questions, and something that comes up quite often. I know it doesn't apply to everybody, but a good section of people would be interested in that. I could spend 20 minutes talking about it. So instead, I'm going to point you to that resource that's online. I think it's quite well written, and it has quite a lot of nice tips on different ways to kind of handle gaps in your CV. Okay, so this is just what that checklist will look like when you get it later on. And I said, here's the link to the visa status tips, and then here's the link to the how to avoid gaps in your CV. Yeah, so just to briefly wrap up what we talked about. So we talked about the timing and when to write your CV. So we talked about the ideal time is when you have a job description in front of you that you're excited to apply for. We talked about the importance of tailoring your CV. So taking the time to tailor your CV for different opportunities. We talked about how to find out what an employer is looking for, and we did that little analysis activity where we went through a job description and pulled out the key skills to develop that blueprint. We talked about some ATS insights, and then we covered some tips on layout and design and formatting. Final tips, final tips. Time boxing, I think, is something that can be quite helpful. So I often work with people for whom career development is kind of taken over their life, right? So they might be sitting there on the couch scrolling through job vacancies as they're watching TV. And then at the other extreme, there's people who totally procrastinate and totally put it on the long finger. So what I often recommend to people who fall into those categories is to schedule some time for your career development each week if it is something that is important for you. And so, for example, you might want to take an hour or two on a Saturday morning and sit down, do whatever is required, be it job search or tailoring your applications or preparing for interview and so on. And finally, have a look through that checklist before you send off that CV. And if possible, get somebody to review it, right? So you can get a family member or a friend or a careers advisor at the university you're at, or an external person to have a look through it and review it for you. Okay, so the recording of this webinar will be available and shared through that follow-up email that I mentioned from the team at jobs.ac.uk, along with the CV template and the CV checklist. The recording will also be available on the careers advice section of the jobs.ac.uk website. If you'd like to recap on any of the topics covered or share it with your network, please do visit jobs.ac.uk and share it on social media. On behalf of jobs.ac.uk, I'd like to thank you for watching, and I hope that you found some of the information shared today helpful. Thanks, and bye everybody.